We were sitting in a little cubicle next to the showroom floor, just a few feet from all of the brand new cars that they keep inside the building for you to sit in and look at. We had been to several different dealers, dealt with several different salespeople and several different vehicles, and we had settled on this car in this place. And it was a salesperson that we had, of all of them, was the one we liked the best. Now there are lots of jobs, and some jobs have negative stereotypes, right? And not every car salesperson is the stereotype of what you think of when you hear that. And the person we were dealing with wasn't that stereotypical car salesman. But he had set us in this cube when it was time to talk dollars and cents, and then he disappeared and he came back with a different guy. And this guy was the stereotype, exactly what you would think. I think that maybe he was the closer, like they kept him in a room and just brought him out when it was time. And we gave him the price that we thought we should pay for this vehicle. He laughed at it, basically. But we had research and documentation of that research. And so we presented that to him, and we went back and forth. And he wasn't coming down as far as we wanted to, and he wasn't going to go for what we were. So now we had come to the point where the one thing I have learned you have to be willing to do when you're negotiating a car price is what? Walk away. Now, walking away from that is easier or harder depending on what you are walking toward. If you have a perfectly functional vehicle and you're just out thinking maybe you'll go for a change and get a different one, walking away might be pretty easy. In our case, we lived in Tampa. We lived far away from lots of things, and often both of us had to be in different places, meaning two cars felt like a necessity, and one of our two had died in the driveway. So walking away was a little bit harder because it was walking back into a situation where we were trying to make do with one car for a little while. Now, long term, that was not workable. Short term, we could do okay. And it was just enough that we didn't like this guy that walking away ended up being okay. So we walked away. They eventually called, right, because we did walk away. And then we talked to the sales guy. We got a decent price on the car. The point is, though, that walking away can be hard. But it really sometimes, too, depends on what you are walking toward. What kinds of things are hard to walk away from?
Bad job.
A bad job. Yeah, now, if you're walking toward a better job or a promise of a better job, maybe. If you're walking toward, if there's nothing to walk toward, it's really hard to walk away from that when you got bills to pay. That's a good one. What else?
Good food.
Good food. I'll come back to that one. A marriage. Right? There's promises that were wrapped up in that, and deep engagement. And sometimes if it's abusive, maybe walking away, but if there's nothing to walk to and there's financial uncertainty or, loneliness feels like what you're walking toward, all of that gets wrapped up in that. So walking away isn't always that place. Good food's a good one. Because walking away from it is maybe walking towards worse food. I think about the game shows where you get to a certain point and they say, you have won $200,000. Now, you can keep that and walk away, or you can risk it all and go for $1 million. And what does it seem like they always do? Risk it all. And how often do they get it? Not very often, right? So walking away in that case would make total sense but that promise of a whole lot more, right? It's sitting there. Anything else we might walk away from? Children in college. But that's a good one, right? Because when you think about, I had a conversation with a mom once whose children were about to go there, and I asked her, what are hobbies, passions? And she had none. Everything had been for children. And when they go away, right, you get to that empty nest thing, and now your identity is so wrapped up in that walking away or walking towards something different is really hard because your identity is wrapped up in that. I think about actors and actresses that get all kinds of facial plastic surgery because it's hard to walk away from those leading roles even as you're aging out of them. Or professional athletes that hang on for way too long because the only thing they've ever known is that sport they've been playing since they were little. And that then gets kind of to be part of your identity. So this idea of walking away from things and walking towards other things, it really is complicated for us as people. Now there's parts of our identities that we can't really walk away from. I'm an introvert, some of you are extroverts. That's just how you are, right? some of us have math, logic brains, others have creative brains, others are mixtures. That's the way you're wired. But there are other parts of who we are that come from our experiences, that come from the contexts in which we live, that come from our community. And so if I ask the question, like, what is our identity? And it might be that we're a parent, it might be that we're married, it might be that we have this job. And how we think about that identity and what it means to maybe have to walk away from that sometimes. Now, Paul, in this letter to the Philippians, gives us a little bit of an example of what this might look like. And in the early part of what we heard today, he's talking about his understanding of himself, his identity. And there's layers to it. So he says, I'm from the people of Israel. So he's got this identity with a whole nation of people. And then he says, but I'm of the tribe of Benjamin. So within that people, there's a narrower range of a family unit, a tribe that he comes from. He says, I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews. And what I read that to mean is that sometimes the people of Israel got mixed in with other peoples, like the people of Moab or wherever they came from. And he's saying, no, I didn't get mixed in with all those people. We are Hebrew people. Like, we're the ones that have always been the pure ones. Then he says, with respect to the law, a Pharisee. Now for us, there's politics and there's religion, and for them, all that was kind of mixed together. So the Pharisees would have been a theological viewpoint, but they also would have been leaders in the community in the way that we think more of political leaders. So when Paul says, with respect to the law, a Pharisee, he's kind of placing himself within the structures and the way that power functions, but also that religion functions. And he comes back to the law later and says, and with respect to righteousness before the law, blameless. He's been super obedient. He has been as faithful as you can be. And so if you take all of this together, Paul's identity is, right, people of Israel, tribe of Benjamin, Pharisee, righteous before the law, always got it right. But then there's one more piece. He said, with respect to zealousness, right, his commitment to that rest of that identity, what did he do? Persecuted the church. That's part of who he was. He said, I was so committed to all of the rest of this that I was willing to persecute other people to protect that identity. And this is the story of Acts. He stands by and I think holds people's cloaks as Stephen gets stoned to death. And then later it tells us that Paul, breathing threats and murder, got letters so that he could go and hunt down Christians and persecute them. So when you take all of his whole identity together, part of it that he claims in the rest of this, he says, I have reason to boast more than anybody else. I was the perfect Hebrew, and I was so committed to it that I was willing to persecute other people, willing to watch them get stoned, willing to hunt them down to make sure that the rest of my identity was not threatened. Now, if we then were to think about our own identities in that way, and again, not the characteristics we might carry around as individual people, but those parts of it that may be our jobs, our marriages, and all the rest of that, we can follow some of Paul's paradigm. And that first part, he's from the people of Israel. What people are we from? United States, right? We're in America. So we would say, if we were saying this, we could say, we can boast more than anyone because we are from America. And then when we get to that next layer, where he is a tribe of Benjamin, we might have to say we all come from different places, right? Like I'm a Norwegian, Swedish, German American, and some of you might be Irish Americans, and there's African Americans and Native Americans. We got all kinds of different melting pot stuff, right? So, but we start with America, and then within that we got these bits. When we get to the part where he says he's a Hebrew of Hebrews, we might, what would we say makes us an American of Americans? Oh, right? We might say you have to be white, right? That's part of that white supremacy thing. What else might we say? Christian.
Lutheran.
We'll get to Lutheran in a minute. That's good. What are our signs of patriotism that makes us pure Americans or whatever that might be? Flags, right? There's all kinds of stuff wrapped up in this, and it can be touchy stuff in this day. But if we say we're Americans and we come from all these strains, and then there's this way of being an American of Americans, then we get to the next part where Paul is a Pharisee, and that may be where we say, well, our theological worldview is Christian, or Lutheran Christian. But then we also might say we're independents or Democrats or Republicans or whatever all the rest of that is, because for Paul that's all wrapped up in there. And so for us that becomes part of that identity. Then we get to the part where he says he's blameless before the law. And we, as people that talk about the good news of Jesus, we would have to maybe say, how do we measure up against the law and the gospel? And what does it mean to measure our faithfulness? Now, would any of us say we are blameless before God and perfectly following the gospel? Maybe not, but we might claim that we're doing our best. So we might say we're Americans and we're from these particular strands of Americans and we are doing the best we can to being patriotic, and we are Lutheran and we are Christian, and we do the best we can to being faithful. Which brings us to the last one, which is that commitment. And we can ask it as a question, like, are you willing to persecute people to protect the rest of that identity? And we would say no to that, right? But then if we say, rather than saying, are you willing to, if we back up and say, collectively, as all of those identities together, right, as Americans of all the different bits and pieces underneath it, do we persecute people to protect that identity? In all kinds of ways, right? Some of them are drones that fly around, and we could justify all of these things. Paul doesn't try to justify his persecution of the church in this text, but that's part of what it is, right? He says he's blameless before the law. If you take the persecution of the church, does that make you blameless before the law? Probably not, because the law included, like, don't murder and all the rest of those bits, and when Paul is persecuting the church, he's running against a lot of that. So there's a little bit of self-misidentification that Paul has, even as he talks about this identity. And so if we take all of this and really think about the ways that we might maybe not actively be the ones doing the persecuting, but the persecution happens collectively on our behalf, right? And that we somehow participate in, if for no other reason we don't fight against it, then we kind of land in that same place as Paul. We've got this whole identity and we're willing to let people be persecuted so that we can keep comfortable in that place. Now here's the thing. Paul tells us that he walked away from that whole identity. He walked away from it, but he had something to walk toward. What was he walking toward? Jesus. He lays out this whole identity, and then he says, but now that's worthless to me. It's rubbish, because I have Jesus. And he talks in particular about resurrection. He's not just walking away from what he used to be, he is walking toward resurrection, which is new life. Jesus died and was raised to new life to give us this new life. And what Paul is saying is, all of what I used to understand to be exactly who I was and the things I held most dear, I'm willing to walk away from that and walk toward Jesus. Now, is Paul going to stop being from the tribe of Benjamin? No. Is he going to stop being of the people of Israel? No. Is he going to stop being a Pharisee? Maybe, but there's probably parts of that he carries with him. Did he stop persecuting the church? He did. And his understanding of righteousness before the law totally changes, and he writes about all of that. So what we see is Paul can't walk away from all of who his identity is, but that is no longer the main thing. What has become the main thing for him is that he is gathered up by Jesus, gathered up in these promises of resurrection, and that now is what he is walking toward. And he even says that. He goes, forgetting what lies behind and straining to what is ahead. So he is striving now for this resurrection. Now, he does not tell us that he is really good at getting there. He was good at persecuting the church, but is he good at... No, he says, Jesus came and made me his own. That's what happened first. Jesus came and made me his own. So Paul can leave behind everything else and say, that's not the most important thing. Now the most important thing is that I walk in the ways of Jesus and walk toward this resurrected life and live differently. And did Paul live differently? Of course he did. Now the thing that I struggle with in this story, how did Jesus make Paul his own after the death and resurrection part? What happened to Paul? Struck blind. So he had this transformational experience. He was blinded. Jesus talked to him. He gets healed. That changes everything for him. And I struggle with this text because then I wonder, do we, to get to the point of being able to walk away from whatever is sort of harmful about our identity and walk toward resurrection, do we have to have that kind of transformational experience? If we're stubborn enough, right? When I was a chaplain at Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio, I had one day discovered I had a 35-year-old patient on the pediatric intensive care unit. He had a heart condition that we have been fixing for a while in little kids, but they missed it in him. And the only doctors that know how to treat it are pediatric doctors. And so there's a 35-year-old guy sitting in this floor with little kids all around him. And I visited with him quite a few times over a period of a couple of weeks. He was waiting for a heart transplant. And every time I talked to him, he talked about the same thing. Cars. He was rebuilding a car in his garage with his kids. He had a boss he worked for that he rebuilt cars for. He fixed cars at the shop where he worked with the boss. He had friends that he fixed the cars. Cars. That's all he talked about. And in a way that you got to get a sense that his identity, right, in addition to being American and all the rest of the bits, was wrapped up in there something that cars were really, really important. Well, he eventually disappeared, and as I was getting close to the end of my time there, I saw a guy walk into the way down the hall with a cane. And once I got closer, I figured out who it was, and he looked a fair bit older, but he came back to thank all of the nurses for saving his life, because I kept him alive long enough to get that heart transplant. And I had an opportunity to visit with him just a little bit, and I said, I bet you can't wait to get a wrench in your hands and get back to working on cars. And he said, none of that matters. None of that matters at all. And he was going to now be focused on living in a different way, because this experience had transformed him and changed his priorities so that he could walk away from all of that and walk in this other direction. So I wonder if we do have to have that, if we're stubborn enough, right, to be able to walk away and walk toward Jesus, to have that kind of an experience. But this is the whole thing about baptism. When we talk about baptism, we talk about new life, but what else do we talk about? Dying in these waters and being then raised to new life. So when we walk away from that, we can walk towards a promise, but it's not an elusive promise of maybe $1 million might be out there, and it's not a possibility of a new job or whatever else we might walk toward. It is the promise of new life that comes in these waters. Now, that promise often seems far off, and this is why I think it's hard for us to walk away from whatever it is that we understand ourselves to be and walk towards resurrection, because if we think of that promise as heaven, how far off is that? We don't know. It's really hard to get our minds around, and it seems like it's something we get to later. If we said that we're walking towards salvation, what does that mean? We can talk about that in all different kinds of ways. But that's not what Paul says the goal is in this text. He doesn't say we're walking toward heaven. He doesn't say we're walking toward salvation. He does talk about moving in the direction of resurrection, but he says that the reward is a calling. It's not a place, it's a calling. A calling from God in Jesus. Is a calling something that we can do today? It absolutely is. And these waters of baptism are part of that calling. It is the promise that we can walk into this place of resurrection, and in that calling, live different in the world. And when you look at Paul's whole journey, that's exactly what he got. He was the Hebrew of Hebrews who persecuted the church, but then he got a calling from God to go and live in a different way. And that calling was so profound that he was willing to die a martyr to live into that calling. And so for us, maybe we do sometimes have to have that transformational experience, but maybe also what we can do is work hard at walking toward that calling. Not because we can claim Jesus, but because he has already claimed us. We are already his. And that calling may look like a whole career, right? There are nurses and teachers and all kinds of other people who understand what they do as a calling, and that God has gifted them to do this. But it also can look like the ways that we live in our marriages and in our other jobs and in our homes and our neighborhoods, and all of the ways that we bring faithfulness and love and mercy and that gospel living into the world. And that can happen right now. It's not something that is far off. It is something we can walk toward because Jesus has claimed us. So may we be blessed as we go out into this week and through the rest of this season of Lent to know that God has already claimed us, but also called us. Called us to maybe walk away from the things in our lives that are a little bit toxic or not very helpful or even harmful to others, and walk toward resurrection, trusting that Jesus will get us there, and in that calling will bring grace into the world through us. Amen.